Hello, you're listening to 194th special episode of Web-standarты podcast. I'm your host, Vadim Makeev from HTML Academy. Today we have two guests, Meyer and Böck. We recorded these interviews at CSS means JS conference in Minsk. And here's our first guest today, Meyer. You probably know who he is, but Eric, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I've been doing the CSS thing for a very long time now. I wrote Cascading Style Sheets, the definitive guide, although now it's just called CSS, the definitive guide for O'Reilly. The first edition, they felt that people wouldn't know what CSS stood for, so they spelled it out. At least in the most recent edition, they felt that it was okay to just do CSS, the definitive guide. I've written some other books. A lot of people use a reset style sheet that I created as an experiment. And I'm currently a co-founder of the US-based conference series and Event Apart, and just a sort of a web standards veteran.
Yeah, you might say that. Yeah.
Yeah, the key to being a veteran in this industry is to get in early and just never go away. So that's the key to my success.
Yeah, I've been around for 15 years as well, so I'm not a veteran, but
veteran enough.
I've seen things.
Yeah.
I met you for the first time in 2006, I believe. That was at Media Conference. It was my first front-end or web conference ever. And I saw you giving, I think it was closing talk. No. You were opening.
I don't remember either, to be honest.
I actually found your blog post, some report from at Media.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, but it's, I think it was a decade of CSS. Something like this.
Yes, that sounds about right. Because sort of the first 10 years of CSS.
Yes. And it was sort of roundup of what happened during that time. You ever tried to do the second roundup, like 20 years of CSS?
No. It's interesting. I think that first decade, people were interested because CSS had survived that first decade. And by 2006, it had caught on fairly.
It proved
fairly
something.
Well. Yeah. I think at this point, it's almost part of the landscape. It would be like, a retrospective of, HTML, which admittedly, I did that here at the conference to some degree, but it just sort of becomes part of the foundation. It's just assumed, CSS has always been there and it's always been successful, even though that's not actually true.
Well, it became foundation in 2006 and now it's 2019. What happened during those 13 years? It became deeply integrated into platform, or has it changed, or
both of those things?
Yeah.
It's interesting. 2006 was right in the middle of when CSS was pretty stagnant. So in that decade, in Internet Explorer, some people listening might not have been there for this, and others might have forgotten, but there was this period where Microsoft said that they were done with Internet Explorer. After Internet Explorer 6, they said, we're good here, even though it was full of errors. But they just stopped developing IE6, which at the time was the dominant web browser, by a long shot. So there wasn't, most standards kind of slowed to a crawl because browsers, the dominant browser wasn't going to change anything. Other browsers hadn't really come up yet. They were starting to. And so actually at that point, it was weird because CSS had survived sort of the choke point of the late 90s to 2000s where it looked like it was just going to get abandoned and had actually become very much an integrated part of the platform. But at the same time, there wasn't really a lot happening. But between then and now, that's all changed. Internet Explorer lost its market share over time. Other browsers arose to fill that vacuum. Eventually, they did start releasing new versions of Internet Explorer again, but after a long pause. And CSS has advanced much further in the last 13 years than it did in the first 10. This is perhaps not surprising. You take those first 10 to get things sort of settled and then launch from there. But there have been a lot of changes in this decade, a lot of advancements.
I guess you can look at it by comparing the size of your book.
True.
Yeah, it's just growing.
I'm trying to think. The third edition actually came out not too long after that at Media Conference, I think.
I think I got my third edition copy to the conference. No, it was second edition. It was a Russian translation of your second edition, and I brought it with me for you to sign.
Oh, okay.
I still have it.
Nice. The first edition was in 1999, and then the second edition was just a few years later, and the third edition, I think, was 2006 or 2007, and it was about 540 pages, roughly, maybe 580, I've forgotten now, but the fourth edition, which came out 2 years ago, was almost 1,100 pages. Now, it had also taken a 13-year or 12-year, whatever, break. So a lot had happened. It doubled in length, not because I wrote more about the stuff in the third edition, but because there was so much to add. Like literally, we had to add chapters on animations and transitions because those weren't in the third edition. Transforms weren't in the third edition, let alone things like Flexbox or Grid, which are in the fourth edition, and a lot of other things besides, shapes and masking and all kinds of things.
And what's lacking from the fourth edition? What's going to be in fifth?
The fourth edition has like one paragraph on subgrid.
Right.
Because at the time I wrote it, subgrid was a thing that was still being talked about, but nobody had any real idea how it would be done.
Well, it's still not around. It's like behind flags.
But the syntax has been settled, and if you use Firefox Developer or Nightly, you can enable subgrid. I've used it in production, but in a way that had a very simple fallback. And so it's coming up, but it's in the fourth edition. It's literally just
mentioned
this very short section of, so one, you can't do these things, and the reason why is there's no subgrid. So one day, hopefully. So that would be in there. Let me think what else.
Custom properties
has come up. I would probably expand that section. Custom properties are in there. And I mean, what's there could stand, but it could also probably stand to be a little bit more developed.
All right.
Filters could probably use a little more work. There again are in there, but
in terms of completely new things, like brand new, probably subgrid.
Yeah, not a lot right now, although that's probably changing. I know CSS nesting is being worked on. That's completely not in there, except I might have said at some point you can't do this, but to be able to nest selectors the way that preprocessors do. I would hope for color functions, but those came out of the color specification editor's draft recently. I hope they come back, but yeah, I'm not 100% sure at the moment.
But we'll see. When it comes.
As things come up, I'll start just working on the fifth edition text, and then hopefully at a certain point, we'll have done enough that.
Do you have some plans for fifth, or just?
The plans are, my plan is, like I say, is to, I need, probably on the flight home from this conference, I'll write the section on subgrid.
All right.
And then I'll look around at some other things, maybe start writing those. And then really the plan is once we get 20-25% change in terms of the material, then it'll be time to publish.
All right. And you've been around, just like you said, you're a veteran. When you're around for so long, for a long time, it's really hard to notice the changes. Like if you look at yourself like 20 years ago, if you see a photo like 20 years ago, it surprises you. Like, oh, I was so young, or something like this. If you compare CSS from the very first draft, like examples from the spec, they look so young.
Yeah.
They look even silly, like links and, so maybe not silly, but naive.
Okay.
That's for sure. If you compare something to modern CSS, I'm not talking about preprocessors. I'm not talking about weird things, CSS and JS, you can do like to wrap around CSS with some tools. I'm talking about plain old CSS, but using modern techniques, like some complex grid spiced up with custom properties and media queries and things like that. It looks so different. And how does it feel to you, like to write the code like this? Is it the right tool for the task? Does it feel overcomplicated? Like, is it going the right direction? What do you think?
I think it is. One of the surprising things, I think, to me, when I go back and look at old examples, is that while they might seem a little simplistic in terms of what they're trying to do, it's not like they look different in terms of the syntax. You know what I mean? The way people write ECMAScript now could look very foreign to someone who started out on the original JavaScript, and vice versa, right? Because so much of the syntax has changed, and I'm sure that it's given more power to developers who write JavaScript, and more capabilities. There's less that they have to sort of do on their own.
But internal logic stays the same.
But CSS, I mean, it looks kind of the same. I think if you had someone who hadn't touched CSS since 1998, 1999, let's say, we'll go back 20 years, and showed them CSS today, they might say, okay, I don't know what these properties and values are, but I mean, it looks like CSS.
All right.
I don't think CSS is too complicated.
You can do complicated things with it.
Right.
But you don't have to.
Right. And even in the way things are done, like Grid does some surprisingly complex and powerful things using not incredibly complex syntax, in my opinion. It's different because it has to be the value syntax. But
I prefer to put away some ASCII art when I develop grids.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the ASCII art thing. I like the ability to specify areas, but I've noticed very, very, very few people do it. Well, right now, I don't see many people doing named grid areas in general. Most of what I see is just using the line numbers or maybe line names, but not saying, just take this and put it in this grid area.
Maybe we were just at the beginning. I
think that's a lot of it. And there's also, if you want to have grid items overlap, then named grid areas don't help you so much because you can't have overlapping named areas without using some very sort of complex fiddly syntax. I mean, you can do it, but you can't do it with the ASCII art version.
If you compare like the first examples of CSS and the early drafts with modern CSS, you can say the same by looking at the modern grid examples and looking at grid examples in 10 years.
Yeah,
they're going to get complex. I think they're going to get more sophisticated.
Yeah. I think that's very true. And you have to remember that original CSS didn't have nearly so many properties.
That's true. Speaking of the number of properties, I like to say that if there is a new property released, if there are like 500 of them, what's the number of properties we have?
Oh, geez, I shouldn't have brought up the number of properties without knowing that, but I don't actually know.
Like hundreds.
Yeah.
If there's a new property,
I think a low hundreds.
Okay, right.
But still,
if there is a new property released, if we have like hundreds of them, it doesn't mean that browser will start working slower because of that. It doesn't mean you'd have to use all of them. You don't even have to know all of them.
Yeah.
You're using tool for the task. You can use less than 100 properties to get the job done.
Yeah, generally speaking.
The number of properties, the number of specs, it frightens people.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed is that there's a lot of people not knowing about properties. For that matter, there's HTML elements that people aren't aware exist, right? Because they're just rarely used. And so the less they get used, the fewer people know about them. And so the less they get used. And so it becomes a feedback loop. And I think the same thing happens in CSS. I find that very few people, and this was actually confirmed in the first talk at the conference on CSS Day, when he was showing the results of the State of CSS survey, the will change property. Very few people know that it exists.
Well, it serves very niche.
Sure, but there's a lot of that happens where like a new specification might come out that has these cool new properties, but people don't necessarily hear about them. And I think to some degree that's because of the way the W3C and particularly the CSS working group manage specifications now, which is like there are all these little modules. There's a text module,
like text UI, background and borders and everything.
Right. So there's like for text styling, there's a module, there's a specification that's just about that.
I like it this way, actually.
And so, which is great for advancement because it means that the working group can work on text styling. They don't have to hold that up because they also have to work on filters. Those things can advance separately, but it also means that when this text module advances, and if people don't notice that it's advanced, then they don't know about these new properties. It just depends on like what has caught people's attention.
Something like text decoration styling.
There are a bunch of new text decoration properties that are coming up now that have actually pretty good support. There's like text decoration. I've forgotten the exact property names, but you can set the thickness of the underline and the distance from the text.
I think it's not width anymore. It's
right.
like thickness or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are these properties to really style underlines and overlines and line throughs. You could take an underline and you can make it like really thick, and then you can set its offset from the text to actually be negative so it gets pulled up.
Yeah.
So a lot of us have seen the style where hyperlinks don't have an underline. They have sort of this like half box under, sort of behind the bottom part of the text. You could do that now with text decoration.
But the problem with those properties is that people gave up on those. They started to use gradients, borders, outlines, or not outlines, but something else.
Right. So because people started doing that, they started hacking their way to do that. The working group looked at that and said, oh, we could actually make that happen using text decoration. But people may have missed the fact that happened.
First of all, they got their use cases.
Yeah.
So they looked at what developers do with gradients, and they made it possible natively.
Yes. The working group these days is really all about use cases. You can propose an idea for a new way to do, a new thing in CSS. And their first question is going to be, what are the use cases? Can you show us use cases? And I think that's actually a good thing, because it means that they're focusing their attention on things that have use, right? Rather than, hey, let's invent a specification to do these things that, we have no idea if anyone would be interested in. People are already doing this. They're actually abusing other properties to get this to happen. Yeah. So how can we make that simpler, more robust, and then, more performant?
And let's make their life easier.
Yeah.
Because hack is always a few steps more in terms of development.
And generally more fragile.
My personal question that I was thinking to ask you, there's a way to scale something in CSS using transform. And it scales independently without affecting neighbor elements.
Right.
Yeah, it's transforming things, just like the other transforms do. And this is probably good for performance and probably good for many use cases. But personally, I have a use case where I developed this HTML slides engine called Shower. And I have slide with fixed width and height, and I need to scale it down and up without touching the content inside. So everything should scale. There used to be zoom property for that. It used to be supported in IE. The way to just make something bigger or smaller, just like you would do with image, for example. You just scale it down, and then the rest of the content will go up. Something like this. And have you heard anything about the zoom property? It used to be supported even in WebKit for some time, I believe. But these days, I have to hack my way into. I used to calculate negative margins.
Yeah.
These days, I use grid for laying out my slides.
Okay.
And then calculate grid size based on the scale ratio. So it's super complicated.
Right.
But I have a way to do this. It's super fragile. It's super complex. Do you think it's a use case for CSS working group? And have you heard anything about the zoom property?
I have not heard anything about the zoom property. Although that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They may have talked about it and I just didn't hear about it.
All right.
So you want to scale something and you want that scaling to trigger reflow.
Yes. So it's not a transform. It's basically a zoom property, for example.
Right. But as something gets smaller.
Yeah, just like setting width and height to an image.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because as you say, if you say transform scale 0.5 or 0.25, it'll shrink, but it'll leave the space behind because that doesn't trigger reflow. It's interesting. I would think with JavaScript, you could observe, you could check for the scaling. And if there's a scaling, there's probably a way to trigger reflow. I don't know that would be at all performant, but it might be a way to do it. But this feels like a use case for exclusions, possibly. I'm not sure.
The main idea behind it is that if you have a block with some text in it, I want this text to scale down or scale up without changing its font size, for example.
Right.
So it would be just basically scaling.
I'm not sure. there may be a way to do that I'm not thinking of at the moment.
I've been doing this hack for 5 years or so in my presentation engine, and I think it's time to propose it to the CSS working group.
Yeah, I mean, the CSS working group has a GitHub repository that's just basically you can post issues, and that would be a place to post the issues to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. Or this is what I want to do. Mm-hmm. This is how I'm doing it. Here's how I think we could do it in CSS. Right? Here's a property and value idea to make that happen, and then hopefully you get feedback.
Okay, I think I'm gonna do this during this Christmas holidays or something.
There you go.
That's an interesting task. I've never done anything like this. All right. Yesterday in your talk, you mentioned a lot of old tags.
Yeah.
That are completely removed from the spec or made obsolete by developers not using them. These are old tags. Do you think we're gonna have some new tags that might solve future UX patterns, for example? We used to have select with option and nested elements for combo boxes. We used to have check boxes and radio buttons. But these days we have those slide triggers. We have some other interface patterns. Do you think it's something for HTML to do, or we're going to have web components, or we're going to have, I don't know, styling is efficient enough to recreate those things over checkboxes and radio buttons, or it should be a soup of divs and tab index and area roles? How we're going to evolve in terms of HTML? Do we need new tags, or we can build on top of old ones?
So I'm gonna go to a metaphor that Jeremy Keith uses, where he's building off of a metaphor that Stuart Brand uses. There are different things move at different rates, right? So in Stuart Brand's, it's something like the Earth changes at very slow rates, and species change at a faster rate than that, even though it might be very much slower than we're used to. And then human culture changes faster than species do, and right. So you have these different layers of different speeds. And Jeremy Keith uses an analogy where HTML moves very slowly, and CSS moves faster than that, and JavaScript moves much faster than either of those two. And that doesn't speak to a particular superiority or inferiority of any of those. It's just that they move at different rates, sort of by design.
Those are different species. Yeah.
But so the idea being that at the JavaScript layer, it's very easy to experiment with things very quickly.
It's very easy to polyfill using the same JavaScript. Sure. So yeah.
Yeah. So you can create a new kind of date picker, right? A date input, maybe using this new interface modality that you've come up with that everyone else goes, oh my God, why did nobody else think of that sooner? Mm-hmm. Right. And then that suddenly is everywhere. And then maybe that makes its way, some of that makes its way into CSS. So you don't have to write all the JavaScript to make it look a certain way. You only have to write the JavaScript to invoke the thing, and then you can use CSS to style it. And then maybe at a certain point, the HTML working group, okay, we actually need to support this at the markup level. And with web components, I think there's probably a similar thing that will happen where, web components will probably start out, a lot of web components will start out as div soup to represent pieces of web components, like dedicated elements. Whether or not those particular elements go anywhere, I can't say.
Like some low-level parts that might be used inside of web components.
Yes.
Interesting.
Right. So I think that's the long answer to say yes. HTML, I think, will advance and should advance, but it shouldn't do so at JavaScript speeds. JavaScript is the layer where all the experimentation happens really quickly and it can move at a feverish pace. It's like fashion almost.
Yeah.
Not in a pejorative way, but fashion changes all the time, and different fashions are experimented with and remixed and put together and all that sort of thing. That's fine. That's where that should happen. I'm paraphrasing Jeremy here, but I completely agree with him, right? And then those, as certain patterns coalesce out of that frenetic activity and become stable, they make their way down to the slower but more stable layers of the stack. I mean, I think these things do slowly make their way into HTML, but it would also, I don't think there's any way to predict what those would be. Okay,
but I haven't seen new elements in HTML for a while. I mean, those slot elements, they're serving basically their placeholder.
Right. But that's the kind of thing, right? It's, that working group.
But I mean, remember,
takes time to think about these things and figure out like what is the most sort of generic, robust thing we could do here.
But remember the difference between HTML 4.1 and HTML5. How many new elements?
Well, yeah, maybe the thing to look at is between HTML 3.2 and 4.01, because HTML5 now doesn't really have, like, they haven't come out with, this is HTML5 and now we're done on HTML6. It's become a lot more like CSS, where HTML5 is sort of continuously under development. And it wasn't a huge number of new elements, if I remember correctly, but they were useful ones.
Yeah, but it feels like we can easily add something like input type something else, like input type range with 2 handles on it. That would be amazing. But why is it not happening? Because I see those things in interfaces everywhere. And to make it work, you have to hack a lot of things. Like input type range with a single handle, it's just a simple tag. With 2 handles, it's your problem.
Yeah, I feel like there's either there either is a proposed way to do that, or it's being
I remember some discussion.
I can't remember what that is now. But yeah, I mean, again, that's, hopefully it would make its way down to that layer, and maybe it would be. But the working group would ask questions like, should it be a modification of the existing range type, or should it be a different input type altogether? And those are slow questions, because the idea is that when you come to an answer, it's not something you threw together and come to regret 5 years later. The idea is that it's still the right answer in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years.
The reason why I'm asking these questions, because I get this feeling from developers, and sometimes for myself, when something is moving so slow that you cannot see it, it feels like it's standing.
Yes.
And you look away and you look back and it's still standing, but at a different place, but it's still standing. So something's wrong there. It feels like it. I don't know. How do we solve this problem? Not with the spec itself, not maybe on developer's side, but somewhere in between, communicating changes or marketing even changes to developer community.
Yeah, I think that would actually help, particularly when it comes to CSS, because CSS, I think, changes on a slow enough time scale that it's easy to miss changes when they happen, but it's on a fast enough time scale that it's worth checking up on.
Yeah.
Communicating changes is a little bit of a challenge. But I also think that to some degree, what's called for is a change of mindset. And it's one of the reasons why I like Jeremy Keith's metaphor so much, is that, you look at HTML and it's just standing there, and you look away for a while and you look back and it's still standing there. And it's easy if you're used to, like, I coded a whole new API this week, right? It's easy to mistake that for stagnation or death.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's still standing.
It's like a basement of a building.
Yeah, I mean,
it's good that it's still standing.
Right. Or the sort of the classic, nobody ever comments when the air conditioning is perfect. People only comment when there's a problem. And it's sort of that background. It becomes a foundation, like you say, and it is. I mean, HTML is the foundation. Everything outputs HTML, whether it's div soup or not. Everything on the web is based on HTML. You probably don't want the foundation of your building to change quickly a lot.
Yeah, move fast and break things. It's not for a foundation.
No, I don't think move fast and break things is a good idea in general at any layer, but that's a whole other podcast.
I agree.
But yeah, it's, actually, I would say take comfort in that stability, that bedrock. And sometimes we think, oh my gosh, I have to code this widget. Why isn't this widget in HTML? Maybe that's, if you've had to do it 6 times in the last 12 months and you see a bunch of libraries that are, or packages or whatever that are meant to specifically solve this problem, that's the thing to flag to the attention of the HTML working group to say, hey, this 2-handle range slider is super common, and yet HTML, read through the spec, make sure it doesn't already support it in some way. And if it doesn't, say, this is a thing, and here's my proposal, right? It usually helps if you say, here's how I would fix it. The working group might immediately say, yeah, no, that's not going to work.
We tried it a few times,
right.
But yeah.
Right. But, you've given them a use case. And so that can be a starting point for just discussion to get something baked into the markup.
Since JavaScript is moving at much faster pace, they have special processes for proposing new things. They have like pioneers, they have like committee or something like this. And is there a process in the HTML and CSS spec similar to this? Or is there a lack of a process that should be established?
Oh, no, there are processes. Whether or not they're the same as the ECMAScript committee, I couldn't say.
I get it. They're not that fast, and they have 6 billion users, or maybe more. I don't know. They're not as crystal clear, I think, as ECMAScript ones, at least to me. Even that I'm focusing mostly on CSS and HTML for many years, but it's still a bit tricky.
That's interesting, because to me, the ECMAScript committee's workings are mostly opaque because I've never really looked at them.
I guess.
Which that's on me, not on them.
I've been following CSS working group in W3C and what WG processes for a while, and I know a thing or two. I'm not reading every minutes from every meeting, but I'm trying to follow close. I still have no clear enough idea to propose new element or to propose new CSS property, for example. So, yeah. Yeah,
I suppose that part hasn't been as clear as it could be. But I know with the CSS working group, it's go to the GitHub repository, try, search through past issues.
Like moving everything to GitHub was a huge improvement.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And that's, I think that's been a big change in the CSS working group's process.
So it's still a way to go.
Yeah, could be.
All right.
I'm not going to speak for them.
And probably the last question, but it's a tough one. Apart from backward compatibility, what do you think about throwing away current CSS and introducing something completely new? Would it be good for the web in any way? Or it's just a total mistake and doesn't make sense at all?
So throwing away CSS, I think, is a total mistake.
Without backward compatibility, I mean.
Well, I just throwing it away in general.
All right.
That support will need to be there for the foreseeable future. And I mean that on a fairly long time scale, because there's so much that depends on it, right? It would be like, let's throw away HTML and replace it with something. You can't really do that.
But maybe not.
Building something new, that's always a possibility. The thing is that whatever is built new will have to address the same problems and satisfy the same constraints that CSS and HTML, and for that matter, JavaScript have, which is that forward, backward compatibility through time, not, from where we are, it needs to be backwards compatible and also provide compatibility moving forwards. I still find CSS, for example, highly approachable, right? It's very easy, much like with HTML, it's very easy to teach someone the basics, like in a few hours.
That's true.
If not less. Like in a morning, I can get somebody up to speed on basic CSS. But then to become a, master of all of CSS, I don't think is a reasonable goal. I know very few people who are a master of all of JavaScript.
Right.
They may be very good at JavaScript, but we see these viral tweets on Twitter where someone says, "Hey, did you know something about JavaScript?" 7,000 retweets, and all the comments are mind blown. Oh my God, where has this been all my life? Even if it's been in JavaScript for half a decade.
Or some other things, like I've been doing JavaScript for 15 years. I'm still Googling this thing.
Yeah.
The same thing.
Yeah. And as Rachel Andrews says, my number one skill is Google. Or in my case, Bing, for various reasons I don't want to get into right now. But
DuckDuckGo.
Also very good. I like that.
My search engine of choice.
Yeah. It's because I don't remember every property and value. I remember a lot of them because that's kind of my thing, right? Like writing the books, a lot of them have gotten settled into my head that, I can literally write linear and radial gradients from scratch without reference to Google. But no one else should expect themselves to do that. The only reason that I can do that is I wrote so many examples when I was writing my book that it just sort of settled in. If it's not something you're doing every day, no, you shouldn't. Nobody should have to remember the exact syntax to create a repeating radial gradient from memory. In the same way that when we were all using complicated doc types, right now it's easy, doc type HTML, like you can remember what that is to type, but they used to be really long and complicated. And almost nobody could retype them from memory. You would just look at your last project, copy paste or whatever. And it's the same kind of thing here. It's if you don't remember all of the animation properties, like all animation duration and delay and so on and so forth, that's not because you're dumb, and it's not because CSS is too complicated. It's just because other things have been occupying your attention. And being able to look this stuff up, I occasionally reach over and pull my own book off the shelf and open it up so that I can how did that work again? I need an explanation to remind me of how this value for this property is supposed to work. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's nobody can remember it all.
Okay, back to this terrible idea to throw CSS away.
Right.
Is there a room, or is there a possibility to revolutionize it somehow? Not just change it at slower pace, which is stable and backward compatible in every way, but somehow make changes similar to what HTML did with HTML5, for example. Different parsing algorithms, different ideas of different semantics for tags. It was a huge step for HTML.
It was huge, but it's remained backward compatible. And I think that's the
main problem.
That is the main hurdle that any new styling language, let's say.
No, keeping it CSS, calling it cascading and whatever, but making it different.
Again, that's a really high bar to clear. It's very difficult. Very, very difficult.
Close to impossible. What do you think?
I'm going to stick with very, very difficult.
All right.
If you want to make a clean break and start with something new, like something that would eventually supplant CSS.
It's so easy to do. Yeah.
It would be easier than trying to overhaul CSS and yet preserve that forward and backward compatibility, which, even CSS and possibly HTML itself do not always succeed at, but they get a lot closer than I think anyone had any right to expect, right? The fact that anyone can load up the very first web page in a modern browser and it works, it does what it's supposed to do.
It's amazing.
That's 30 years. That's kind of astonishing.
Yeah.
And also on the flip side, if you have an HTML-based document, not one that's being completely written out of JavaScript, but one that's an actual HTML page, and you load it up in one of those first browsers, it will mostly render.
Yeah, this is it. I don't have any questions left.
Okay.
I just want to thank you for being around for all those years and reminding us that it's okay that we have a stable basement, and it's okay to have a backward compatibility, because we're a lot of front end in this area, and they're young. They really want to move fast and break things, and it's good to have someone reminding that we still need to keep the web working.
Yeah, novelty is always appealing, right?
Yes,
new and shiny, but there's a great deal of value and appeal in things that aren't always new and shiny, that you can rely on in the way that you rely on your house to keep standing and the earth to continue to be a planetary body, those sorts of things.
And also thank you for meeting a Russian-speaking community.
Oh, I was glad we can make it work this year. Tried a couple times, and this is the first time it's worked out, and I've been really glad to come.
Hope it's not the last one.
Yeah,
I'll definitely keep inviting you to St. Petersburg.
Okay.
Okay,
thank you.
And here's another guest. We have Max Böck. You just gave a talk. Your cheeks are still blushing after the talk. You're still on adrenaline.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. How it went?
I think it went very well. I had the feeling that I had some good points in there, and I had some very interesting conversations already with some attendees. And it's an interesting thing to hear responses from people in the audience afterwards.
So you gave a talk on CSS mindset, the way we think about CSS and the way we deal with CSS these days. But where it came from? It's just another language been around for 25 years already, or something even more, probably, or around that.
Around that, I think.
Around that. And it seems simple to me. I work in education. I teach some CSS and HTML, and it's some ideas, probably grid layout or flex boxes, how to divide spare space between blocks and everything. It's might seem complicated to new developers, but in general, selectors, specificity, cascading. Yeah, what's wrong with CSS in people's heads these days?
I don't know if there's anything wrong with it. I think it's what they say is that CSS is a very easy language to learn, but it's a very hard language to master. because it's of course very straightforward to just learn the properties and learn concepts like Flexbox or even Grid maybe. But I always get the feeling when talking to developers who are new to CSS that the problem is not so much the technical side of it, but the overall architecture that's involved in building a larger UI. Because you can, of course, find tutorials on everything for maybe a certain type of layout, but you don't really find any resources on how to think about these things on a larger scale and what mental models are beneficial to writing maintainable code. So I guess that's where the idea for the talk came from.
All right. You mentioned in your talk that cascaded with your friend. I think it's one of the main failing points in developers' heads these days for CSS. Just yesterday, I was explaining collapsing margins to a few hundred students online during my lecture. I explained it this way. Back in 1996 or 7, 8, we were inventing CSS to style basically text documents. So collapsing margins made sense back then. These days, we don't have collapsing margins in Flexbox, in Grid layouts. They just don't work inside those formatting contexts for a reason, because we expect better control over what we're doing.
Exactly.
We're expecting less magic.
Yeah, to some extent, yeah.
Yeah. And the same applies to cascading CSS, the same apply to specificity, complex selectors and everything. It feels like it's a bit, it was invented many years ago, and it's really hard to apply to modern tasks.
Yeah, I hear this a lot where it's usually compared to, okay, CSS was invented for documents and now we live in a more of a component age where we style maybe web apps that follow a completely different style. That surely has its reason, but I think we have to consider that CSS grew and evolved over time. There's an active community working in it, of course. We still have to think about backwards compatibility, and we still have to maintain some sort of universal nature of the language. You can't just switch the way things work. But I think there are ways to navigate CSS in the component age or in the web app age that are certainly possible even with what we have today. And we see that in the more modern layout engines we have now.
Yeah, I totally like the idea of backward compatibility. Like in 20 or 50 years, or like maybe in the next century, some people would be able to read the documents I create right now, websites and even web applications, that would be awesome.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe they would look silly. They would definitely look silly.
The design might be a bit out of trend. Yeah.
And language, imagine like reading Shakespeare this day, and something like this. But they will be compatible, because even these days, I know there are some formats that are dead because we lost source code for parsers or something like this from 80s or from 70s. So some files we cannot open because we lost some source code that was able to like decompile or parse. That's not going to happen for the web, I guess, because it contains the whole humanity invented. But backward compatibility is very, very cool. But I think it stops us from evolving, from revolutionizing CSS, or inventing something completely new. I don't know if there is something better than CSS out there, but I can imagine we could come up with something eventually that it's not compatible with this, with the very idea of CSS.
Interesting. So you would be in favor of like a new language, a completely new style language that just makes a clean break and starts from zero and like incorporates more of these modern concepts?
I wouldn't say so.
Because I don't know if I would be such a fan of that, actually.
I was protecting web standards and semantics and clean CSS and things like that for 10 or 15 years already. And I'm still for it with all my soul in heart.
Yeah.
But
it is called the Web-standarts podcast, right?
Yeah, that for a reason. But it feels to me that there is a big part of the community, probably involving some JavaScript developers, mostly experiencing the different way of developing the language, like JavaScript, in much faster pace, in a different fashion. And they see results every year they have some features, even minor features, or some huge features like native module system in JavaScript, ECMAScript modules, things like that's going to change everything, how we work, how we load JavaScript. But we don't see things like this happening in CSS. And I wonder why. Is it only backward compatibility, or something's wrong with standardization processes, or something else?
I don't think that there's something wrong with standardization process. And it certainly is true that CSS is moving at a much slower pace than JavaScript if you compare like just new features that came out over the recent years. But I think they have to consider there's a lot of sides to this, because even when debating just a small addition to the spec, there will always be people who say, no, we need to do it this way, we need to do it that way. And of course, that creates a lot of friction. I think the people in the CSS working group are doing a tremendous job navigating this landscape. I want to pick up on what you said earlier, because I think that modern developers, or developers who are mostly focused on JavaScript and who are used to building very modern web app type of things, they can actively give feedback to the CSS working group and maybe say, look, our whole group of developers needs this feature, and then we can look at it that way. But I wouldn't necessarily want a completely new styling language. I would want it to be an extension of CSS that takes all these new inputs into account. That would be my dream.
Yeah, I can totally imagine CSS slowly, and the main word here is slowly, evolving into something different. If you take the first web page published on the web, or maybe not the first one, okay, maybe some samples from the very first CSS draft. If you take those examples and compare it to something crazy, like I have this HTML presentation engine called Shower. I'm doing some crazy things over there, using calc, using CSS variables, and things like that, and there's magic happening there. It looks like they're two completely different languages, like 20 years difference between them, even more. Maybe in the next 20 years, we'll have something backward compatible, but looking completely different. True programming, even.
I could imagine that. I could even imagine some sort of logic inside CSS where you would maybe have like if conditions or something like this. It's not happening today, but if you look at the timescale involved here, there has been some tremendous progress. I mean, CSS started out as a bit of color and maybe some margin and padding.
Basically, it was a way to underline links.
Yeah. Because people were starting to wonder, hey, how come I can't style my document the way I want it? Then all these things happen. And I see amazing things happening with CSS. Like, I don't know if you've seen this, it looks like a photorealistic drawing of the glass of water with the lemon. I can't even imagine how to go about that. That's not practical, but it's certainly incredible that it is possible. There's also some stuff like if you look at Houdini at a vehicle to maybe more rapidly work on new CSS features. There are some very talented people working on that, and they're implementing stuff that might one day make it into the CSS spec. So that's an interesting way to go around the standards process a bit and try out different stuff and see how people like it.
I remember myself thinking, variables in CSS, that's not gonna happen. No, never. No way. No. It's CSS. It's declarative. Okay, we have calc. That's all right. But variables, no. Then it happened. Now I am looking forward, or not sure, into nesting in CSS. They have a fresh new draft. They have some idea how to implement it. And it's basically very similar to what's happening in preprocessors. Even ampersand should work, but in a different manner.
It's not the exact same syntax that we might have in SAS, but it's the same concept.
It's similar. Like, it's not that different as those dollar variables were different from custom properties. Personally, I prefer custom properties because they're super flexible, because they're relying on actual HTML structure. And
so they're great for like dynamic changes.
Yeah. Because I even try to call them not CSS variables, but custom properties all the time, because they're not really variables.
I think that's the proper name. Actually, just people are used to calling it a variable.
I think they mentioned variables in somewhere in a specification description. That's why it's both variables and custom properties.
Yeah.
So they also have var function when you apply it. So it's
a bit confusing. Yeah, no, they're not variables; they're custom properties, but we call them with a var keyword, like any other language calls variables. But.
So going from there, we might have nesting soon. We might have something else soon, like color functions to modify colors, like you can do in preprocessors,
like adjust hue or
something like this. Not just in HSL function, but different parts, like make some hex color lighter or darker or mix colors, for example. That would be wonderful. So coming from there, I'm slowly going into direction of preprocessors. I saw some preprocessor examples in your code on your slides. Probably. I saw some dollar something.
I might have SAS in there. I have to check.
Yeah, but maybe I'm wrong. But do you still use preprocessors in your daily work, or do you have a reason to do this, or it's just an old habit?
So my setup is pretty standard SAS with BEM, but I use SAS mostly for two features. And the thing that I like most is just being able to create separate files. And that works very nicely with the BEM idea of having like one component namespace. So I have like a header BEM class and then a header SCSS file that maps to that, which makes it very easy to mix and match these partials together. That I use, and then just for some shorthand mix-ins that create a media query.
All right.
But I use very little of SAS, so I can easily imagine not doing that at some point and just using CSS natively if it fits this workflow.
All right. That was my question, actually. I started to use less and less SAS over the last years. And then for my personal projects, I just start with plain CSS. And then I have everything I need, basically. If you want to have some like variables in media queries, there's no way to do this because those are custom properties. There's no way to define custom property inside of media query because it's property of an element, and yeah. It's complicated.
That's one thing that makes it a bit different from the static SAS variables.
Yeah. That's the main bummer.
If you write just CSS, do you still use this technique that we used to have, where we have like one very large style sheet and then separate it logically with comments?
No. I actually have style CSS file with a bunch of imports. And then I import my components, my BEM components as well. But then, so when it's in development, I use imports. So I have my styles in separate files.
Oh yeah, and then just build it into one style.
And while it's in development, I code reload it without any build step. And only when I build it for production, I stitch everything together.
So you get around the performance implementation.
Yes, because like imports are terrible for performance and they delay the drawing. That's my workflow these days. Because custom properties, I got it. Nesting, I don't need nesting, basically. Mixings, I prefer to do mixings. It's my favorite joke. I prefer to do mixins in HTML via class names.
Sorry, more like a utility class approach.
I don't go the full utility class road because personally I hate it, but I if I need to combine something, I just combine it on HTML. But there's a mixing concept in BEM. You can mix two blocks, for example. So that's my setup. I don't feel like I'm doing this just because I want to show off. Like I don't need preprocessors. That's enough for me. I think with nesting, it will be the last reason for developers to even use preprocessors. Or is there any other? Because like in your case, when you're using imports, you can just add build step, like to combine files together.
Yeah, you can do that. I think it will come down to the individual workflow that some people have. And like I mentioned, I'm still using some of the variables that come from Bootstrap that do not actually generate any CSS. But it's nice to have like a structure of, I can have one place where I define my font stack and my colors and my Z-index scale. And you can do that with custom properties as well. But I think at some point I am going to do this. At some point I want to switch back to like native CSS, because I'm just a big fan of removing complexity from any project.
Yes,
even if it's just SAS, because SAS is not that big of a deal. But if you can do it without any other technology, it's almost always better to just keep it simple.
All right. But BAM is a way to pretend that we isolate blocks.
True.
We have some ideas how to work around those problems, but there's no real mechanism in CSS to actually isolate even CSS modules.
Yeah,
we're just automating BAM basically.
Right.
And in some cases, it just doesn't work.
It's a way to pretend that there's scope in CSS, which there isn't.
Do you think we're ever gonna have some sort of scoping or maybe a next version of CSS when you have scoping by default, and if you don't need scoping, you pass some extra flags and it applies everywhere?
I don't know what they will come up with, but this is such a hot topic. This is basically it's the reason why CSS in JS was invented to...
Well, it's not the only reason. I think the number one reason is because CSS doesn't really fit into modular workflow.
Yeah. I mean, it has a bunch of other very good aspects about it, and it fits very nicely with the React way of thinking about components. But this ability to just say, okay, I can be absolutely certain that what I'm writing in my CSS now applies only to this component ever. And then making sure that will always be the case with machine code. And I think it's very important to have that. I just question this notion that it is the one true way to go about this. So basically, I understand that if you have a team with lots of different developers, it becomes increasingly difficult to communicate and to make sure that everyone follows the same pattern like them. But it's still, there's two different ways to solve this scoping. And one is with technology and one is with humans. For my setup, I prefer to do it with communication. But I can imagine that since this is something that so many people want, that it might eventually work its way into CSS in some form, that maybe you could set a scope for a different block of CSS and then bind that to your HTML. I don't know. But I'm excited to find out.
Personally, I'm a bit disappointed by Shadow DOM and how it isolates, because
that was the big hope, right? That would create scoping. It's not really getting there.
Yeah. Well, there is a way to do this, but at some extent, but not fully and not reliable enough. I don't know. There's something wrong.
I played around a bit earlier this year with web components. I think I had like lit element and lit HTML as the basis of that. That was a new concept for me, the shadow barrier and the shadow DOM. Yeah. And it's easy to wrap your head around that. But as you say, it didn't really fit in with my expectations of what it could accomplish. But yeah, it's still young. Maybe in the next iteration they'll change it.
Yeah, maybe. Because what you typically expect from Shadow DOM is like to have an iframe. I don't know, like complete isolation.
Yeah,
sort of.
I mean, you can in your CSS you can sort of reach into that Shadow DOM.
Yeah, that's weird because we expect the complete isolation, I guess, by default.
But I think it's also nice that you can penetrate that Shadow DOM barrier, but you have to be very explicit about it. There's no way that would happen on accident. I think that somebody would declare the shadow root there, or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't have that much experience with web components yet, but I imagine it's a different game than, some developer just quickly changing some style and then all of a sudden it affects something you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, maybe it's the thing that's going to save us all from, I don't know, CSS and JS hell. Personally, I consider it hell because I see a lot of people struggling with hundreds of little libraries that offer you the solution.
There's lots of new things popping up every day.
And they have great ideas and then downsides at the same time. And it's a mess. So some of them are well known, like style components, for example, like CSS modules, not maintained even these days. Some other, and they all treat CSS like compile target. They're not trying to use CSS. They're trying to use only like properties and values.
Exactly. It's about putting a bit of style on top of the actual substance of your app, which is JavaScript. And I understand the need for that. And I personally don't use it, but I'm not against anyone using it. My main problem with it is just moving the style layer of your app into JavaScript, which is just not as reliable as having a separate style sheet and having CSS not as a compile target, but as a standalone thing you control.
Yeah. And it provokes developers to do weird things like implement hovers or transitions or things like that via JavaScript, to have their states, to play nicely with the whole.
Yeah. But that's actually a nice hook for a CSS mindset, because if you're a JavaScript developer, you think of a hover state as a state. It's in the name right there. And state in JavaScript is something very different than what it is in CSS. And of course, you can implement it in JavaScript, but that's really not using what it's for. And I mean, CSS was developed exactly for that use case. So I think it's not wise to not use the tools you have and instead reinvent them in your favorite language.
You know, I was really disappointed when I figured out that there's no way to use web components without JavaScript.
Yeah,
because
you still have that dependency.
Yeah. The main problem here is that you can do a lot of mistakes in HTML, and browser will fix them, and it will render something at the end. The same with CSS. Declaration is broken. Yeah, I'll read another one. The next one. No problem. In JavaScript, 1 comma, and you have a blank screen.
Yeah. You could be completely correct because, people have linters and have test cases. But even if your JavaScript is completely fine, it might just fail because of a bad connection, or just a certain percentage of JavaScript requests just time out.
Or because I have an old iPad with iOS 7 where ECMAScript is not supported.
Exactly, yeah. And then if your actual content inside a web component depends on that very brittle connection, that's a big risk to take.
So I'm all for new and shiny glory things, futuristic technologies we have these days. Atomic CSS and CSS in JavaScript and everything. But if it's that fragile as JavaScript, then it's the wrong solution. At the very end, I just want to say that's good to see someone standing at the conference and protecting the way we used to think about CSS and HTML, and not proposing something new, shiny, and completely unreliable. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me.
You were listening to 194th special episode of Web Standard Podcast. I'm your host, Vadim Makeev. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Cheers!